There is a moment, and you have probably already lived through it more than once, when you sit down at the end of a perfectly ordinary day and feel a heaviness that has no obvious cause. Nothing catastrophic happened. Nobody yelled at you. You didn't get terrible news. You just feel used up, like someone opened a valve somewhere inside you and something important drained out while you were answering email. You'll tell yourself you're tired, and that's true in the way that calling the ocean wet is true. Technically accurate and completely uninformative, because the tiredness is a surface reading. It's the number your mind prints out when it pulls the body and doesn't want to look too carefully at the raw data. What's actually happening underneath that tiredness is far more specific, far more physical, and far more advanced than you realize. Your body has been trying to send you a message for weeks, maybe longer. It has been altering your immune function, adjusting your hormone output, changing the way your gut processes food, shifting the electrical rhythm of your heart between beats. It has been doing all of this quietly, competently, and without your conscious permission. And the strangest part, the part worth thinking about carefully, is that the system doing this is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. Your body is not malfunctioning. It is preparing for something it believes is coming. The problem is that what it believes is coming is not actually a threat. It's just your life. Most people think of burnout as a psychological event, a mood, a mindset problem, something that happens when you've had too many hard weeks in a row and haven't taken a vacation. And because we frame it that way, as a problem of attitude or scheduling, we tend to reach for psychological solutions. Think positive, set boundaries, meditate, take a long weekend, drink more water. None of that is wrong exactly, but it's a bit like telling someone whose house is on fire that they should consider adjusting the thermostat. The advice is related to temperature, yes, but it has fundamentally misidentified the situation. Here is what's actually happening. Burnout is not primarily a psychological state. It is a physiological cascade. It begins in the body, in the adrenal glands, in the vagus nerve, in the lining of your intestine, in the spaces between your heartbeats. And only later does it become something you can identify as a feeling. By the time you feel burned out, you are already well downstream of where the process started. You're reading the river at the delta, and the headwaters shifted weeks ago. But this is not a metaphor. This is measurable. And once you understand how it works, how the body accumulates stress damage on a ledger your conscious mind never sees, it changes the way you listen to yourself permanently. Let's start with something concrete. Deep inside your brain, sitting just above the roof of your mouth, is a small region called the hypothalamus. It is roughly the size of an almond. It doesn't do your thinking. It doesn't hold your memories. What it does is something more fundamental, and it regulates the internal environment of your body. Temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep cycles, and critically, your response to threat. When the hypothalamus detects stress, and it defines stress far more broadly than you do, but initiates a hormonal relay. It sends a chemical signal called CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, down to the pituitary gland, a pea-sized structure hanging off the bottom of the brain like a tiny chandelier. The pituitary, in turn, releases ACTH into the bloodstream. ACTH travels to your adrenal glands, two small caps of tissue sitting on top of your kidneys, and tells them to release cortisol. This is the HPA axis, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal. 3 organs, 3 chemical handoffs, 1 coordinated response, and in normal operation, it's elegant. Cortisol surges, you deal with the problem. Cortisol drops, the system resets. But here's where it gets interesting. The system was built for threats that end. A predator chases you. You escape, your cortisol spikes, your cortisol falls. A storm comes, you find shelter, the axis returns to baseline. The entire architecture assumes that stress is an event, something with a beginning and an end. Modern chronic stress has no end. The deadline isn't a predator. It doesn't beat. The financial worry doesn't get resolved by running. The relationship tension doesn't get metabolized by a burst of physical action. And so the HPA axis keeps firing, not dramatically, not the way it would for an actual emergency, but at a low, sustained hum, a background signal like a smoke alarm chirping every 40 seconds because the battery is low. Over weeks of this, something changes. The system doesn't just stay elevated. It starts to dysregulate. Cortisol rhythms flatten. Normally, this cortisol follows a sharp curve, high in the morning to wake you up, declining through the day, low at night to let you sleep. Under chronic stress, that curve loses its shape. The morning peak blunts, the nighttime trough rise. You wake up tired and go to bed wired, and the reason is not that you're bad at sleeping. It's that your neuroendocrine axis has remodeled itself around a signal of permanent low-grade threat. This happens before you feel burned out. It happens while you still think you're just a little busy. Now, if cortisol dysregulation is only the first chapter, because your body has another system running in parallel, one that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves, and it is watching your internal state with extraordinary precision. The vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It wanders from the brainstem down through the neck, branching into the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. Its name comes from the Latin word for wandering, the same root as vagabond. And what it does primarily is carry information upward. About 80% of the signals traveling through the vagus nerve are afferent, meaning they go from the body to the brain, not the other way around. Your brain is not just commanding the body, it is listening to it constantly. This is the basis of something researchers call interoception, your brain's ongoing, mostly unconscious perception of the internal state of your body. Heart rate, gut motility, inflammation levels, blood pressure, respiratory rhythm. All of this streams upward through the vagus and feeds into regions of the brain that generate your baseline sense of how you feel. And here's the critical point. Interoception is not a feeling, it is a process. You don't experience it the way you experience seeing a red car or hearing a loud noise. It operates below conscious awareness, shaping your mood, your energy, your motivation, your capacity for patience, all without generating a clear, legible signal you can point to and name. When the vagus nerve detects sustained physiological stress, when it registers that cortisol patterns are abnormal, that inflammatory markers are rising, that the gut is behaving differently, it updates the brain's internal model, and the brain responds not with a clear thought like you're burning out, but with a vague, formless shift in background feeling. You become a little more irritable, a little less interested, a little more prone to feeling overwhelmed by things that used to be manageable. You attribute this to circumstance, to the project, to the weather, to getting older. You almost never attribute it to what it actually is, a signal from the body, delivered through a nerve you cannot feel, telling you that your physiological reserves are depleting. There is a story from medicine that belongs here. In the 1960s, a physician named Stuart Wolfe became curious about a small town in eastern Pennsylvania called Roseto. The town had been settled by Italian immigrants in the 1880s, and it had an unusual distinction. The rate of heart disease in Roseto was roughly half the national average. The men over 65 were dying of heart attacks at a rate that seemed almost impossible. Wolfe and his colleague John Brune investigated. They looked at diet. The Rosetans ate plenty of fat, smoked freely, and were not particularly fit. They checked genetics. Relatives living in other parts of the country had normal heart disease rates. They tested the water supply. Nothing explained it. What they eventually concluded was that the protective factor was social. Roseto was an intensely close-knit community, multi-generational households, nightly walks, communal meals, a social fabric, so dense and supportive that the physiological effects of stress were being buffered at the bodily level. And then they predicted something. They said, if Roseto's social structure breaks down, the heart disease rates will rise. Over the following decades, as younger generations moved away, as the tight community frayed, as the town became more typically American in its individualism and social isolation, the heart disease rate climbed. By the 1980s, it matched the national average exactly. This is not a parable about being nice to your neighbors, though that's fine too. This is a measurable demonstration that social connection, or its absence, directly modulates the physiological systems we've been discussing. The HPA axis, vagal tone, inflammatory load. The body does not distinguish between a tiger in the grass and the chronic low-grade stress of feeling unsupported, unseen, and perpetually behind. To your adrenal glands, loneliness and deadlines speak the same chemical language, which means that burnout is not just about how much you work. It is about the physiological context in which you work. Two people doing the same job can arrive at entirely different bodily states because the nervous system is weighing variables that never appear on a timesheet. Let's go one layer deeper. When cortisol stays elevated and then begins to dysregulate, it loses its ability to do one of its most important jobs, controlling inflammation. Under normal conditions, cortisol acts as an anti-inflammatory brake. It keeps your immune system from overreacting. But when the cortisol signal becomes noisy and flattened, when the receptors that detect it start to downregulate because they've been saturated for too long. Yeah? That brake weakens. The result is a slow rise in systemic low-grade inflammation, not the kind you feel as pain or swelling, not the kind that shows up as a red-hot joint. This is subclinical. It circulates inflammatory cytokines, small signaling molecules like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha begin to drift upward. C-reactive protein, a general marker of inflammation, ticks higher. And this matters enormously because these molecules don't just affect the body. They cross into the brain. IL-6 and TNF-alpha alter neurotransmitter metabolism. They reduce the availability of serotonin and dopamine precursors. They change the way the brain allocates energy and motivation. And this is why burnout feels like depression but is not identical to it. The symptom overlap is significant. Fatigue, anhedonia, difficulty concentrating, social withdrawal. But the underlying mechanism has a different origin. Burnout-related neuroinflammation is driven by a peripheral stress cascade that feeds back into brain chemistry. It is the body dragging the mind down, not the other way around. And the most unsettling part, this inflammatory shift can be measured in blood work weeks before the person reports feeling burned out. The body knows, the blood knows, the immune system has already started reorganizing. The mind, with its stories and rationalizations and habit of muscling through, is the last to find out. There is one more signal worth understanding because it's the one that makes the invisible ledger almost legible. Your heart does not beat like a metronome. Even when your pulse feels perfectly steady, the interval between beats varies by milliseconds, but measurably. This variation is called heart rate variability, or HRV, and it is not noise, it is signal. High HRV, a lot of variation between beats, indicates that your autonomic nervous system is flexible. Your parasympathetic branch, the rest and digest system, mediated heavily by the vagus nerve, is active and responsive. You can speed up and slow down smoothly. You are, in physiological terms, adaptive. Low HRV means the opposite. Your system has become rigid. The sympathetic branch, the accelerator, is dominant. You're locked into a narrower band of physiological response, less flexible, less resilient. Under chronic stress, HRV drops, sometimes dramatically, and it drops early, before mood changes, before sleep fully deteriorates, before the person would describe themselves as burned out. HRV is one of the first measurable casualties of sustained allostatic load. That's the term for the cumulative wear on the body from repeated or chronic stress activation. Think about what this means. Your heart is encoding information about your stress state in the spaces between its own beats, and this information is more accurate and more timely than your self-report. You will say you're fine. Your heart will disagree, not in words, but in the mathematics of its rhythm. There is something almost philosophically interesting about that. We think of self-knowledge as a mental act, as introspection, as sitting quietly and asking yourself how you really feel. But the body has its own form of knowledge, written not in language, but in cortisol curves, vagal tone, cytokine levels, and the microsecond gaps between heartbeats. And that knowledge is, by every measure we have, more honest. One more system, because the story is incomplete without it. Your gastrointestinal tract contains roughly 500 million neurons. This is the enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, though that label is slightly misleading because it implies it is secondary. It is not. It operates with significant autonomy, managing digestion, nutrient absorption, and immune surveillance along the massive surface area of your intestinal lining. It also hosts the majority of your body's serotonin production. About 90% of your total serotonin is manufactured in the gut, not the brain. And it communicates with the central nervous system primarily through you can probably guess, the vagus nerve. Under chronic stress, the gut changes, intestinal permeability increases, the tight junctions between cells in the gut lining loosen slightly, allowing molecules that would normally be contained to leak into the bloodstream. This is not the dramatic leaky gut of wellness marketing. It is a subtle, well-documented, stress-mediated shift in barrier function, and it contributes directly to the systemic inflammation we already discussed. The microbiome shifts as well. The populations of bacteria in your gut are exquisitely sensitive to stress hormones. Cortisol and norepinephrine alter the composition of gut flora, favoring species associated with inflammation and reducing those associated with calm and metabolic stability. This happens within days of sustained stress onset. Days. So when you feel that peculiar loss of appetite, or the opposite, the compulsive, joyless eating that accompanies burnout, it is not weakness. It is not lack of discipline. It is the enteric nervous system responding to a stress signal that the rest of your body has already been processing for some time. The gut knew before you did. It was already reorganizing. There is one more casualty to account for, and it may be the most revealing because it touches the one part of the day when your conscious mind is supposed to step aside entirely. Sleep is not a uniform state. You don't just fall asleep and wake up. What happens in between is an elaborately staged sequence of neural activity. Cycles of light sleep, deep slow-wave sleep, and REM sleep, repeating roughly every 90 minutes across the night. Each stage serves a distinct biological function. A slow-wave sleep is when the lymphatic system clears metabolic waste from the brain, including beta amyloid, the protein associated with Alzheimer's disease. REM sleep is when emotional memories are processed and integrated. Light sleep stages serve as transitions and contribute to motor learning and sensory consolidation. Yet this architecture is not optional. It is not a luxury feature of human biology. It is the nightly maintenance cycle on which cognitive function, emotional regulation, immune competence, and metabolic health all depend. And chronic stress dismantles it piece by piece. Elevated evening cortisol. The flattened curve we discussed earlier directly suppresses slow-wave sleep. It shortens REM periods and increases the number of microarousals, those brief awakenings you may not even remember, but that fragment the continuity of sleep cycles. The result is a night that technically lasts 7 or 8 hours, but delivers perhaps 60% of the restorative value it should. You know what this feels like. You've lived it. You sleep enough hours, but wake up feeling unrested, slightly foggy, with a kind of cognitive thickness that a cup of coffee can mask but never fully resolve. And because you slept, you conclude that sleep isn't the problem. It must be something else. Age, maybe, or the mattress, or just the way things are now. But it is sleep. Specifically, it is the internal structure of your sleep, quietly degrading under the pressure of a stress axis that won't fully stand down. The stages are compressed, the cycles are fragmented, the deep restorative phases are shortened, and because you have no conscious access to your own sleep architecture, you can't feel the difference between a full slow-wave cycle and a truncated one. The damage accumulates invisibly. Here is the compounding problem. Sleep is when the body is supposed to repair the damage from the day's stress. Cortisol clears, inflammation calms, HRV recovers. The immune system recalibrates, but if the sleep itself is compromised by the very stress it's meant to recover from, you get a feedback loop with no exit. Stress degrades sleep. Degraded sleep reduces recovery. Reduced recovery increases the next day's vulnerability to stress. The spiral tightens. This is measurable too. In studies of occupational burnout, disrupted sleep architecture, particularly reductions in slower wave sleep, appears early and worsens predictably as burnout severity increases. It is not a consequence of feeling bad, and it is a driver of feeling bad. The body is losing its primary repair window, and it is no way to tell you except through symptoms you're likely to attribute to something else entirely. Let's pull all of this together now. What we're really talking about is allostatic load, the total accumulated cost of the body's efforts to maintain stability in the face of chronic stress. It is, quite literally, a physiological debt. And like financial debt, it accrues silently. You don't feel each increment. You don't get a monthly statement. The interest compounds in the background, and by the time you notice the balance, the number is larger than you expected. The term comes from Bruce McEwen, a neuroendocrinologist at Rockefeller University who spent decades studying what chronic stress actually does to tissue. Not what it feels like, what it does. McEwen drew a distinction that matters enormously. Allostasis is the body's ability to achieve stability through change, to adjust cortisol, heart rate, immune function, and blood pressure in response to shifting demands. That's healthy. That's adaptive. That's the system working as it should. Allostatic load is what happens when the demands never stop and the adjustments never fully reset. The machinery of adaptation starts to wear, not because it's fragile, but because it was never designed for permanent activation. Here is the sequence laid out plainly. Chronic stress activates the ACET, PA axis, cortisol rhythms flatten. The anti-inflammatory brake weakens, systemic inflammation rises, vagal tone drops, HRV decreases, the gut barrier loosens, the microbiome shifts. Sleep architecture compresses and fragments inflammatory cytokines, reach the brain, and alter neurotransmitter availability. Mood, motivation, and cognitive flexibility decline. Immune function weakens. You get sick more often and you recover more slowly. All of this is happening in the body, measurably, physically, chemically, on timelines of weeks, not months. And meanwhile, your conscious mind, the part you think of as you, is busy constructing a story. You're just tired. It's the season. You need coffee. Maybe you're coming down with something. You'll feel better after the weekend. You'll feel better after the project ends. You'll feel better after the holidays. The mind is not lying exactly. It is doing what minds do, pattern matching to the simplest available explanation. And the simplest explanation is always situational. It's always external. It's always temporary, because admitting that the problem is systemic, that your body has been accumulating damage on a ledger you weren't reading, requires a kind of self-awareness that the brain is not built to spontaneously generate, especially not when the very systems that produce self-awareness are already compromised by the process they'd need to detect. There is a tragic recursion in that. The thing that would help you notice the problem is degraded by the problem itself. Your capacity for clear self-reflection is reduced by the same inflammatory neurochemical process that you need to clearly reflect on. Prefrontal cortex function, the part of the brain responsible for executive judgment, long-term planning, and honest self-assessment, is exquisitely sensitive to both sleep loss and neuroinflammation. It is by cruel design the first higher cognitive function to degrade and the last to recognize its own degradation. This is why burnout so often progresses until something breaks, a health crisis, a collapse, the moment where the body finally forces the mind to pay attention by making the signal too loud to rationalize away. Not because people are stubborn or unaware, because the biology actively conceals the problem from the one system that could intervene. And there is something worth sitting with in that fact. Yet we spend most of our lives assuming that the mind is the senior partner, that consciousness supervises the body, directs it, knows what it's doing. But in burnout, the hierarchy inverts. The body knows more than the mind. The body is more honest than the mind. The body has been keeping meticulous records while the mind has been writing fiction. And the body will eventually win the argument because it is arguing with chemistry and the mind is arguing with stories. So what do you do with this information? The first thing, and perhaps the most important, is simply to take it seriously. Not in a worried, hypervigilant way, not by obsessing over cortisol tests or buying another wellness gadget, but by genuinely updating your model of what burnout is. It is not a mood. It is not a mindset failure. It is a measurable physiological state with specific and identifiable mechanisms, and it begins in the body before it arrives in the mind. That shift in understanding changes what paying attention to yourself actually means. It means that these subtle signals, the morning heaviness, the low-grade digestive trouble, the way you keep getting that one cold, the sleep that technically lasts 7 hours but leaves you feeling like you slept in a cement mixer. These are not trivial complaints, they're data, honest data, from systems that don't know how to rationalize, don't know how to push through, and don't know how to perform being fine. It also means recognizing that recovery is not a weekend. A Saturday on the couch doesn't reverse weeks of HPA axis dysregulation any more than skipping one meal reverses months of poor nutrition. The body recalibrates on its own timeline, which is slower than the mind's and far less responsive to good intention. Real recovery, the kind that allows cortisol curves to normalize, vagal tone to restore, inflammation to recede, and sleep architecture to rebuild, requires sustained change in the conditions that produce the load, not a break from the stress, a genuine alteration in the ratio of demand to recovery, held long enough for the biological systems to believe it. That's a harder message than take a vacation, but it's more honest. And honesty is the whole point here. Your body is not fragile. It is adaptive and astonishingly resilient, but its resilience operates on a budget, and it accounts for expenditures with more integrity than your conscious mind. It doesn't round down. It doesn't defer payments. It tracks every sustained demand, every unresolved activation, every night of shallow sleep, every week of running on cortisol fumes, and it writes the total into your vagal tone, your inflammatory profile, your cardiac rhythm, and your immune readiness. There is, if you think about it, something remarkable about that. You walk around inside a body that is, at every moment, conducting an honest audit of your life. Not your life as you describe it to friends, not your life as it looks on a calendar. Your life as it is actually materially, chemically experienced by the tissues that sustain you. That audit doesn't care about your explanations. It doesn't care that you're almost done with the project, that things will slow down next quarter, that you're handling it. It simply measures the cost of what you're doing and records it faithfully. The question is not whether your body is keeping this ledger. It is. The question is whether you're willing to read it before the balance comes due, because the body, in its strange, wordless chemical honesty, has been trying to tell you something for longer than you're thinking. It is not asking you to panic. It is not asking you to stop everything. It is asking for something simpler and, in a way, more difficult. It is asking you to believe it. Not your story about how you feel, not your explanation for why you're tired, and not the version of yourself you perform at work and repeat to friends, just the plain, unnarrated, physiological truth, written in the rhythm of your heart, the chemistry of your blood, the quiet architecture of your sleep, and the patient, unglamorous signaling of a body that has been paying attention the whole time, waiting for you to do the same.